Hi, and thank you for tuning in to Gavin Lon Digital. I'm Gavin Lon. So, we have now created the CRUD-related code for the category item, content, and media type entities. In the previous video, we made UX, user experience, related refinements to the create and edit views pertaining to the category item entity. This particular refinement involved replacing the default DatePicker widget provided in popular browsers with the jQuery UI DatePicker widget. So we incorporated a third-party DatePicker widget into our web application. There are two main reasons for this refinement. We are able to ensure that the DatePicker widget has a consistent look and feel across multiple browsers. And the use of the jQuery UI DatePicker widget is fairly versatile in terms of the customizations that we can make to the DatePicker widget, which can be both functional customizations and cosmetic customizations. So in this video, we are going to make further UI-related refinements to the category item, content, and media type entities. We are going to make two UI refinements pertaining to the entities that have just been mentioned. This second refinement involves appropriately labeling the relevant fields on the relevant razor views pertaining to the relevant entities. This refinement will be done in order to provide more human-readable labeling for the relevant fields, and in doing this, enhance the user's experience with our web application. The first refinement is that we'll implement appropriate field validation code for the relevant form fields pertaining to the relevant entities. There are several attributes built into .NET that we can declare against relevant properties in our models to facilitate field validation in the relevant razor views. The declaration of these validation attributes in our code indicates to .NET which fields must be validated and how they should be validated. We don't need to write the validation logic ourselves because behind the scenes, as it were, .NET does the heavy lifting for us. .NET runs the necessary logic to validate the relevant user input and outputs the appropriate HTML code to the browser based on the validation results. For a better understanding of C# attributes, please view a video created for this channel on C# attributes. I've included a link to this tutorial below in the description. So let's better understand this by implementing field validation in our .NET Core MVC web application. For content like this and much more, please consider subscribing, and please ring the bell so that you'll be notified of future content. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up, and please share this video with anyone you feel may benefit from its content. If you'd like to thank me by buying me a coffee, I've included a link to my Buy Me a Coffee webpage below in the description. It will be greatly appreciated. So, let's start with the category entity. Let's open the category class that represents the category model. So we want to ensure that the user enters a value for the title field before saving the user's input to the system, i.e., we need to enforce a rule whereby the user cannot leave the title field blank. We can enforce this as a rule by declaring the required attribute against the title property. As you can see, the code for this has already been implemented. Note that the built-in .NET field validation related attributes that we are implementing in our code are members of the system.componentModel.dataAnnotations namespace. So let's ensure that we have the appropriate using directive at the top of our code. So we also want to enforce a rule that the user is unable to enter less than 2 characters for the title field, and that the user cannot enter more than 200 characters for the title field. We can use the string length attribute to enforce the desired rule. As you can see, the code for this has already been written. Before we test our code, I'm going to change the value of 200 to 10, which is the value that denotes the maximum allowable characters that a user can enter for the relevant field. This modification is to make it easy for us to see the effect of this particular restriction that we are imposing using the string length attribute. So let's run the code. So if I try to save the data to the system by pressing the Create button, you can see we are presented with validation-related error messages. These messages present to us in red text. Let's focus on the message under the title field. The error message we are seeing under the title field is a default error message provided by .NET for the case when a user violates the rule imposed on a field through the implementation of the required attribute. Later, I'll demonstrate how we can override the default error message with our own custom error message. So, if we enter a character into the title input field, the required default error message disappears because we are no longer violating the required rule. However, as you can see, the string length validation rule is currently being violated by our input. So, we see the default error message pertaining to the string length attribute displayed to us. When we enter another character, we have now entered two characters, so we are no longer violating the rule imposed on the title input field through the use of the string length attribute. So the default error message pertaining to the string length attribute disappears. So the absence of an error message under the title field immediately makes the user aware that the relevant field input is now valid. This is great in terms of user experience. Real-time UI status updates go a long way in terms of enhancing a user's experience with our applications. The validation for if we attempt to enter more than 10 characters, remember this is what we specified for the maximum length restriction, is executed differently to if a user attempts to enter less than 2 characters, i.e. the minimum length restriction. No error message is displayed, but we are literally restricted from entering more than 10 characters into the title input field. So, the heavy lifting in terms of validation implementation is done for us by .NET. All we need to do as developers is declare relevant validation-related attributes against relevant properties in our models. Great! If we look at the source code for this page, more specifically at the code pertaining to the title input text field, we can see HTML5 attributes that contain the data prefix are contained within the title input element. So when the MVC framework returns the HTML to the client, when the user's inputted data is deemed invalid, these validation-related attributes are appropriately included in the relevant input elements. So a combination of .NET, HTML5, and jQuery are leveraged to facilitate client-side validation for the user. Note that the layout views in our projects include references to the appropriate jQuery library. .NET appropriately updates the relevant HTML5 attributes, and jQuery can read these attributes on the client side and output appropriate messages to the user based on the user's input. Code on the server side within the relevant action methods is also implemented to prevent data that is deemed as invalid from being saved to the system. So let's see how we are able to override validation error messages using the relevant validation attributes. So we can set the required attributes error message property like this. Although we should probably include a more polite custom error message. Let's run the code. Great. So I think we should use the required attributes default message in this case. Let's set the title field's string length maximum value restriction back to 200. So the next change we can make has nothing to do with validation, but it's to do with enhancing the user's experience, UX. So, by default, the MVC framework is going to label our text input field that corresponds with the thumbnail image path property exactly as the property is named within the category class. We can override this default behavior by declaring an attribute named display against the relevant property. So let's say we want the label that corresponds to the thumbnail image path property to be displayed to the user as thumbnail space image space path. We can set the name property of the display attribute to the appropriate text like this. This labeling is clearly better in terms of human readability. Great. So, if we look at the partial view reference in our category entities create view that is encapsulated within the script section here, we can see that there is a call to the partial view named underscore validation scripts partial. If we open the underscore validation scripts partial view, we can see that two specific jQuery libraries are referenced. We can in fact comment out the call to the underscore validation scripts partial view, and our validation will still work, because the necessary validation will still be carried out on the server. But by including a reference to the relevant jQuery libraries here, a lot of the validation can be carried out on the client, making the validation code better in terms of user experience. The code is more responsive and performant and creates an overall better user experience. So it is better to leave the call to the underscore validation scripts partial view in here, because it contains a reference to two jQuery libraries that can help facilitate a better user experience with our application. So let's set our attributes appropriately for the category item model. So the appropriate validation attributes are already declared against the title field. Let's declare a required attribute against the media type ID property. The media type ID property represents the value containing an item selected by the user from the media types drop-down list. You can see that we have included a default option in the select element that represents the media types drop-down list. We don't want the user to select this item before saving data to the system. We only want this item to serve as a prompt for the user. An informational item, if you like. Notice that the default option element's value attribute declared within this select element is set to an empty string, so it doesn't contain a value. If the user selects this item and then attempts to save the category item data to the system, we want this action to be prevented and an appropriate message displayed to the user. So we want this field to be deemed as invalid and an appropriate error message to be displayed under this field. So we can do this by declaring the required attribute against the media type ID property here. So I've noticed that for some reason the span element used to display the exception message to the user for the media types drop-down list field is missing from the create view. So let's appropriately add the relevant span element like this. Let's run the code. You can see that when the appropriate create post action method is executed, that when the state of the model is checked through this line of code, that false is returned from the relevant expression, preventing the code to save a new category item to the system from running. We do not want this invalid data to be saved to the system. So the data is not saved to the system and the user is presented with the create view once again. So before we continue, we have a bug that we need to fix here. I've noticed that when we are presented with the create view after our input is deemed as being invalid, the media types drop-down list only contains the default option and does not contain the options that we have already saved to the database, i.e. the article item and the video item. We must include the media types currently saved to the system when the create view is presented to the user after the user's input has been deemed as invalid. Great. Let's declare the display attribute against the media type ID property so that a more human-readable label is included for the corresponding field presented to the user. Let's do the same for the datetime item released property. Great. Let's make appropriate UX-related code modifications for the content entity. Great. Let's also make appropriate UX-related code modifications for the media type entity. In the interests of creating a consistent look and feel across all of our Razor views, let's widen the div element that contains the relevant form fields for our media type entities, Create View and Edit View. Great. The last item I wish to discuss in this video is that we can customize our UX code related to validation so that a summary related to the invalid fields is presented to the user once the user has attempted to save invalid data to the system. So if we look at the div element here, positioned within our form element at the top here, we have a tag helper attribute named ASP-validation-summary. This attribute is currently set to a value of model only. This means that currently the validation-related error messages will only be displayed below the appropriate fields. If we set the ASP-validation-summary attribute to all, a summary of all invalid field error messages will be presented at the top of the page to the user. Great. Let's say we don't want a summary like this presented to the user, so let's ensure that the appropriate attribute is set to model only. Great! For content like this and much more, please consider subscribing and please ring the bell so that you'll be notified of future content. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. It will be greatly appreciated. And please feel free to share this video with anyone you feel may benefit from its content. If you'd like to thank me by buying me a coffee, I've included a link to my Buy Me a Coffee webpage below in the description. It will be greatly appreciated. I really enjoy your comments, so please feel free to engage with me in the comments section. The latest code can be found on GitHub. I've included a link to the relevant repository below in the description. Thank you and take care.